My name is Arthur Bishop. I'm 71 years old now, but the story I'm about to tell you happened in two parts, starting about 6 years ago. For 35 years, I was a law enforcement officer with the United States Forest Service. My whole life has been spent in the woods, specifically the Idaho Panhandle, the deep, tangled green of the Kniksu National Forest. I know the sounds of that place. I know the tracks, the smells, the subtle shifts in the wind that tell you weather is coming. I know the difference between a cougar kill and a wolf kill just by looking at the carcass. I thought I knew every secret those mountains held. I was wrong. I was dangerously, catastrophically wrong. This isn't a story about Bigfoot or some backwoods ghost. This is about something real, something that left scars on me you can see and a whole lot more you can't. The first incident was in late April of 2018. The snowpack had been heavy that winter, and it was a late melt. I'd called my old friend Dave Miller to ride up with me to my cabin. Dave and I came up through the ranks together in the Forest Service, and he'd retired a couple of years before I did. My cabin wasn't some fancy A-frame for weekenders from the city. It was a solid log structure my grandfather and I built over 50 years ago on a small parcel of private land completely surrounded by national forest. It was my sanctuary, my anchor. It sits at the end of a 20-mile stretch of gravel and dirt called Forest Road 278. In the winter, it's completely inaccessible. I wanted to get up there to check for snow damage, make sure no trees had come down on the roof, and just air the place out. Dave met me at my house in Sandpoint just after dawn. He threw his gear in the back of my 3/4-ton Ford, a beast of a truck I'd owned for a decade and trusted more than most people. He climbed in, smelling of coffee and chewing tobacco, and grinned. "You sure you old fossils are up for this, Art?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I was 65 at the time, Dave a year older. We weren't spring chickens, but we were both still sturdy, still capable. We'd spent our lives hauling gear, hiking rough country, and dealing with whatever the woods threw at us. "Just try to keep up, old man," I grunted back, and we shared a comfortable laugh. The drive started like any other. The pavement gave way to gravel, the houses grew farther apart until there were none, and the endless sea of pine and fir swallowed us whole. The air grew cooler, cleaner. It felt like coming home. We were about 15 miles up FR 278, crawling along in second gear to navigate the ruts and washouts from the melt, when I had to brake hard. Lying square in the middle of the road was a white-tailed doe. It wasn't roadkill. I hadn't been going fast enough to do that kind of damage, and besides, the scene was all wrong. I put the truck in park and we both got out, the gravel crunching under our boots. The air was still and cold. The silence was the first thing that felt off. No bird song, no chattering squirrels. Just the low hum of my truck's engine and the whisper of wind through the high pines. The kind of silence that means a major predator is nearby. We approached the carcass cautiously. My hand rested on the .357 Magnum I always carried in the woods, a habit from my LEO days. Dave had his hand near his own sidearm. The doe was torn open from brisket to pelvis. That wasn't unusual for a predator kill. What was unusual was the sheer explosive violence of it. The rib cage was shattered, with ribs broken outwards, not cracked and chewed inwards. It looked like something had reached inside and pulled it apart with incredible force. One of the hind legs was completely gone, not chewed off, but twisted and ripped from the socket. There were no drag marks to suggest it had been killed elsewhere and moved. It had died right here. "Grizzly," Dave said, his voice low. He spat a stream of tobacco juice off to the side. "Big one. Just out of the den and in a real foul mood." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. I've seen what a grizzly can do. They're messy, powerful animals. But this was different.
There were no massive claw marks raked down the hide, no bite marks from the wide jaw. The flesh was torn, ripped in great chunks, and the spine was snapped clean in two, as if a giant had picked it up and broken it over a knee. There were tracks in the soft mud at the edge of the road, but they were a chaotic mess, churned up and indistinct, except for one partial print that made the hair on my arm stand up.
It was long, almost like a bear's hind foot, but narrower, with distinct toes and what looked like a claw mark for each one. But it wasn't a bear track. The shape was wrong. Maybe, I said, not wanting to argue. We were seasoned woodsmen. We relied on logic and evidence. The most logical explanation was a bear. Anything else was stepping into foolish territory. Still, the feeling of wrongness clung to me like the mountain chill. We grabbed the deer's remaining legs and dragged it to the side of the road, into the ditch. The carcass was still warm. Whatever did this was close. As we heaved the body into the brush, my eyes scanned the dense wall of trees on the other side of the road. I felt like I was being watched. It was a primal feeling, one I'd learned to trust over my career. It's a feeling that keeps you alive. I saw nothing but shadows and deep green, but the feeling persisted. We got back in the truck, the smell of blood on our hands and a new, unspoken tension in the cab. We drove the last 5 miles in silence, the easy camaraderie of the morning replaced by a shared, low-grade anxiety. The cabin came into view, looking just as I'd left it in the fall. Solid, quiet, reassuring. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney. No, not smoke. It was just condensation in the cold air. The roof was clear of fallen trees and the windows were intact. I felt some of the tension ease out of my shoulders. It was just a bear. A big, nasty bear had made a kill on the road. Nothing more. We parked the truck, and the familiar routine of opening the cabin for the season took over. We unlocked the heavy oak door, propped it open to air out the musty interior, and got to work. Dave checked the propane lines, while I opened the shutters and inspected the wood stove. Everything was as it should be. By late afternoon, a fire was crackling in the stove, chasing the chill from the room. We sat at the small kitchen table, drinking coffee laced with a bit of whiskey, and the world began to feel normal again. We talked about our grandkids, about fishing trips we planned to take that summer, about the state of the world. The sun began to dip below the jagged peaks to the west, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it was immense, a quiet reward for living so far from the noise of civilization. It was in that deep twilight, when the world is caught between day and night, that we heard the first sound. It was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, but not quite. It was deeper, more resonant, a heavy branch breaking. We both froze, listening. It came from the woods north of the cabin, maybe 100 yards out. Deadfall, Dave muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. We waited. A few minutes later, we heard something else. Footsteps. They were heavy, slow, deliberate. This was no deer picking its way through the underbrush. This wasn't the shuffling gait of a bear. This was a steady, rhythmic tread. Thump, pause, thump, pause. It sounded bipedal. It sounded heavy, far heavier than any man. I got up from the table and moved to the front window, peering out into the gathering dark. Dave followed, standing just behind me. The clearing around my cabin was about 50 yards across, a space I kept clear for fire safety. The tree line at the far edge was a wall of blackness. The footsteps stopped. The woods went silent again, but this time it was the same oppressive silence we'd felt back at the carcass. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, our eyes straining to see into the gloom. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Every instinct I had was screaming that we were in danger. And then I saw it. It stepped out from behind a massive Douglas fir at the absolute edge of the clearing. It wasn't a full emergence, more like it was using the tree for cover, leaning out to observe us. It was a silhouette, a massive shape against the slightly less black background of the forest. It was tall, impossibly tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. It was broad at the shoulders, with a frame that tapered down, and it was standing on two legs. It wasn't a bear standing up to get a better look. A bear's shape is distinct, a pear-like body on thick legs. This was different. This was anthropomorphic, but grotesquely so. I couldn't make out any details, just the sheer size and the fundamentally wrong shape of it. It just stood there, perfectly still, watching the cabin. "What in God's name is that?" Dave whispered, his voice tight with disbelief and fear. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice barely a croak. I felt a cold dread snake its way up my spine. This was something outside of my experience, outside of any known category of North American wildlife. We watched it for a full minute, frozen in place. Then, as silently as it appeared, it stepped back behind the tree and vanished. It didn't make a sound. A thing that large should have crashed and snapped its way through the woods, but it was gone. Just gone. We locked the door, a heavy deadbolt I'd installed myself, and secured the shutters over the windows. The cabin was built like a small fortress, but it suddenly felt terribly fragile. We didn't talk about what we saw. We didn't have to. The question hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. We checked our firearms. My .357 was fully loaded. Dave jacked a shell into the chamber of his 12-gauge pump shotgun, the sound unnervingly loud in the small space. We turned off the single propane lamp we had lit, plunging the cabin into near total darkness, save for the faint orange glow from the stove's grate. We sat in the dark, listening. For an hour, there was nothing but the sound of the fire and our own breathing. I started to think, to hope that it had moved on, that it was just a strange shadow, a trick of the fading light. Then we heard a new sound. It was the soft crunch of gravel. It was in the clearing. It was approaching the cabin. No, not the cabin. It was approaching my truck. I crept to the front window and peered through a small gap in the shutters. The moon was rising, a pale sliver that offered just enough light to see. The creature was standing next to my Ford, and now I could see it. The sight has been burned into my memory, a permanent fixture in my nightmares. It was at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, coarse-looking hair that was the color of charcoal and mud. It was powerfully built, with massive shoulders and a chest that looked like it was carved from oak. Its arms were too long for its body, ending in what looked like large, human-like hands, but with thick, dark claws where the fingernails should be. It walked on 2 legs, but its legs were jointed wrong, like a dog's, with a backward-bending hock. It moved with a smooth, predatory grace that was terrifying. But the head was the most horrifying part. It was the head of a wolf, or a huge dog. A long snout, powerful jaws, and tall, pointed ears that swiveled independently, listening to the night. Its eyes glowed with a faint, reflected light, 2 embers of amber in the darkness. It was a perfect, living synthesis of man and wolf, a creature from the darkest corners of folklore, made real, and standing 20 feet from my window. It was sniffing the air, its head moving back and forth. Then it turned its attention to my truck. It reached out with one of its long arms and placed a hand on the hood. Then it did something that defied all logic and physics. It leaned its weight and lifted. The front end of my 3/4-ton pickup, a vehicle that weighed over 6,000 pounds, rose a foot off the ground. The suspension groaned in protest, a high, metallic shriek that cut through the night. It held it there for a moment, then dropped it with a deafening crash. It was a display of raw, impossible strength. Dave let out a choked gasp behind me. The creature then circled the truck, moving with that uncanny, silent gait. It ran its claws along the driver's side door, leaving deep gouges in the metal, the screech making my teeth ache. It seemed to be studying the vehicle, not with the blind curiosity of an animal, but with a kind of cold, analytical intelligence. It wasn't raging, it was assessing. It stopped at the front grille again. It lowered its massive head and sniffed at the engine. Then it did the most intelligent and most terrifying thing of all. It crouched down, reached underneath the front bumper, and with a series of sharp, violent yanks, began tearing things out. I heard the sickening sound of hoses being ripped free, of wires snapping. Fluid began to pool on the ground beneath the engine. It was deliberately and methodically disabling our only means of escape. That was the moment my training kicked in, pushing past the paralysis of fear. This thing, whatever it was stranding us. It was isolating us. That was a tactic, a strategy. This was not a dumb beast. This was a hunter. "It's trying to trap us here," I said to Dave, my voice shaking. "We can't let it get to the cabin." He nodded, his face pale in the faint light. The creature finished its work on the truck and then turned its attention to the cabin. It took a step towards the front porch, its head low, a low, rumbling growl starting deep in its chest. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, a physical presence in the room. I knew I had to do something. Letting it get to the door, letting it test the strength of the logs in the lock, was not an option. I raised my revolver, my hands surprisingly steady. "I'm not trying to kill it," I told Dave. "Just scare it off. Be ready." I aimed high, through the window, over the creature's head towards the trees behind it. I squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the .357 Magnum inside the enclosed cabin was titanic. It was a physical blow of sound and pressure. My ears rang instantly. Outside, the creature flinched violently. It wasn't the reaction of an animal hit by a bullet. It was a reaction of pure shock at the noise. It stumbled back a step, its head jerking up. It let out a sound that was not a growl, not a howl, but an enraged, guttural roar that was part dog, part man, and all nightmare. It stared at the cabin for a long second, its amber eyes burning with what looked like furious intelligence. Then it turned and melted back into the darkness of the tree line. We didn't sleep. We couldn't. We spent the night sitting in the dark, weapons in our hands, listening to every creak of the logs, every whisper of the wind. For hours we heard it moving out in the woods. It was circling the cabin, staying just out of sight. A branch would snap to the north, then minutes later, a heavy footfall would sound to the south. It was letting us know it was still there. It was patient. It was waiting. The psychological pressure was immense. Every shadow that danced in the firelight was the creature. Every gust of wind against the walls was the creature trying to get in. It was a long, dark, terrifying night, the longest of my life. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. The woods fell into that same profound silence again. We waited until the sun was fully up, until bright shafts of light were cutting through the gaps in the shutters. We cautiously unbarred the door and stepped outside. The air was cold and crisp.
The clearing was empty.
There were tracks in the soft earth around the truck and leading up to the porch. They were huge, 5-toed, vaguely canine, but also disturbingly manlike. We checked the truck. It was a mess. The battery cables were torn out, radiator hoses were ripped in half, and a bundle of wires from the ignition system was gone. It was completely, utterly dead. We knew we couldn't stay. We didn't know if it was gone for good or just resting, waiting for the next night. We packed light, water, the last of our coffee in a thermos, and every round of ammunition we had. We abandoned the cabin and started the 20-mile walk back down FR 278. That walk was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow across the road sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. We walked back to back at times, scanning the woods on both sides. The feeling of being watched was constant, a heavy weight on my shoulders. We saw nothing, but we felt it. It was out there, paralleling us, just inside the cover of the trees. We never felt safe until our boots finally hit the blessed asphalt of the state highway. We were lucky. A logging truck came by a few minutes later and gave us a ride into town. We must have looked like we'd seen a ghost. In a way, we had. The next day, I called the sheriff's office. I knew the sheriff, a man named Bill Peterson. I'd worked with him on cases for 20 years. I told him the story, leaving out the more unbelievable parts at first. I just said a very large, aggressive animal, most likely a bear, had disabled my truck and stalked our cabin. I asked if he could send a deputy up with me and a tow truck. He agreed, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. The deputy who met us was young, barely 25. He looked at the truck, at the claw marks on the door, at the ripped-out wires. "Wow, big bear," he said, with an almost dismissive tone. The official report listed the incident as property damage by bear. The tow truck driver said it looked like a marmot had chewed the wires, that he saw it all the time. They explained away every single piece of evidence with a mundane, plausible, and completely wrong explanation. I tried to tell them what we had really seen. I described the creature. The deputy gave me a look that was a mixture of pity and concern. He suggested that maybe in the poor light, a large black bear standing on its hind legs could look like something else. He asked if Dave and I had been drinking heavily. I was a respected retired federal officer, and I was being treated like a crazy old man. It was infuriating. It was humiliating. I felt utterly helpless. Dave, for his part, refused to even talk about it. When asked, he just shook his head and said, "It was a bear." He told me later he just wanted to forget it ever happened. He never went into the deep woods again. A week later, I got a private call from an old friend, a senior warden with Idaho Fish and Game named Mike. His voice was low, cautious. "Art, I read the report on your truck," he said. "Listen to me. Don't go back up there. We've had calls out of that basin for 30 years. Strange tracks nobody can identify. Hunters who go in and never come out. Livestock found torn to pieces in ways that don't make sense. There's no official file. These are just the spook stories the old-timers tell the rookies. But there are too many of them. Whatever you saw, you're lucky it let you walk out. Let it go. Sell the place. Just stay away." His words were a cold comfort. They confirmed I wasn't crazy, but they also confirmed that the authorities knew something was out there and were actively choosing to ignore it, to bury it. I was on my own. For 2 years, I followed Mike's advice. I stayed away. But the cabin and what happened there gnawed at me. My grandfather's journals were in that cabin. My father's hunting rifle. Things that couldn't be replaced. More than that, it was a matter of pride. I had been run off my own land by a shadow, and I couldn't accept it. I rationalized. Maybe it was a one-time thing, a transient creature that had long since moved on. Maybe Dave and I had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The fear faded, as even the most potent fears do, replaced by a dull ache of memory and a stubborn refusal to be cowed. In the fall of 2020, I decided to go back. I told my wife I was going to a friend's place to help with some work. I lied. I knew she, or anyone else, would try to stop me. This was something I had to do alone. The drive up FR 278 was different this time. The oppressive silence I remembered from before was now a constant companion. The forest seemed darker, the trees thicker. I was armed, of course.
My .357 was on my hip, and my .30-06 hunting rifle was on the passenger seat next to me, loaded. I drove slowly, my eyes scanning the woods, my senses on high alert. About halfway up, I saw something that made me stop. Scratched into the bark of a large cedar tree was a symbol. It was a circle with 3 vertical slashes through it. It was clearly not natural. The cuts were deep, made by something sharp and powerful. A few hundred yards further, I saw another one. It was a territorial marking, a warning. My rational mind tried to tell me it was just some kids, but I knew better. No one came up this road. I reached the cabin. From the outside, it looked untouched. My old, disabled truck had been towed out 2 years prior, so the clearing was empty except for my new one. I got out, rifle in hand, and did a slow, careful circle of the building. The claw marks were still visible on the old door. The wood around the lock was splintered and chewed, as if something had been testing it, trying to find a weakness. The shutters were still closed, but the one on the back window was hanging by a single hinge. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The inside was cold and musty, but undisturbed. Nothing had gotten in. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I spent the next few hours working. I aired the place out, got a fire going in the stove, and started gathering the items I had come for. I worked with a constant sense of urgency, wanting to be done and back down the mountain before dusk. The sun was already slanting low through the tall pines, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. I was packing my grandfather's journals into a box when I heard it. It was a soft thud against the west wall of the cabin. I froze, every muscle tensed. It sounded like someone had thrown a heavy rock against the logs. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window on that side, peering through the gap in the shutter. I saw nothing at first, just the dense woods. Then, a flicker of movement. Something dark was moving between the trees. It was big. I held my breath, waiting for it to step into the open. Then, from the other side of the cabin, the front, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. It was a low, guttural click, like 2 stones being knocked together. It was a signal. My heart sank. It wasn't one. There were 2 of them. They were coordinating. They were hunting. This wasn't a chance encounter. They had been waiting for me. The one at the front stepped into the clearing. It was the same one from before, I was sure of it. The same towering height, the same monstrous build. But seeing it in the clear light of day was 1,000 times worse than seeing it as a silhouette in the dark. Its fur was a matted, filthy black, caked with mud and what looked like old blood. Its muscles bunched and shifted under the hide as it moved. Its canine face was scarred, one ear torn. Its yellow eyes were fixed on the cabin, burning with a malevolent intelligence that was utterly chilling. It took a few steps forward, then stopped, its head tilted as if listening for the response from its partner. Then the attack began. The one in the back, which I still couldn't see clearly, threw its full weight against the wall. The entire cabin shuddered. Logs groaned and dust rained down from the ceiling. It was trying to break the wall down.
At the same time, the one in the front let out a terrifying barking roar and charged the porch. It didn't bother with the door. It slammed into one of the thick log posts supporting the porch roof. The wood splintered with a sound like a gunshot. It hit it again, and the post snapped. The corner of the roof sagged downwards with a scream of protesting nails.
They were systematically dismantling my sanctuary, trying to flush me out or bring it down on top of me. I was trapped. Panic tried to claw its way up my throat, but I forced it down. My training, my years of facing down armed and dangerous men, took over. I was not going to die here. I moved to the front window, chambered around in the .30-06, and took aim at the creature on the porch. It was tearing at the other support post now, ripping out huge splinters of wood with its claws. I centered the crosshairs on its massive chest, a place where a heart should be, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against my shoulder. The bullet hit home with a wet, heavy thud. The creature screamed. It was a sound of agony and fury, a high-pitched canine yelp that devolved into a deep, human-sounding bellow of rage. It stumbled back off the porch, clutching at its chest. Dark blood, almost black, pulsed between its claws. But it didn't fall. It looked at the wound. Then it looked directly at my window, and its eyes met mine. The hatred in that gaze was pure, ancient, and personal. It was no longer just a predator hunting prey. I had heard it, and now it wanted to kill me. It charged the window. I didn't even have time to work the bolt for another shot. Its shoulder hit the wall just below the window with the force of a wrecking ball. The log shuddered, and the window frame exploded inwards, spraying me with glass and splintered wood. Its massive clawed hand shot through the opening, swiping blindly. I threw myself backwards, and the claws raked across the space where my head had been, gouging deep furrows in the interior log wall. From the back of the cabin, I heard a tearing, splintering sound. The second one, the one I hadn't seen, was ripping the shutter off the rear window. I was being flanked. I scrambled back to my feet, my mind racing. I was in a fatal funnel, a kill box of my own making.
The big one was trying to force its way through the front window, its roars of fury shaking the very foundations of the cabin. I knew I couldn't fight them both. I had to get out. I had to make a break for the truck. I ran to the back room, the one where the second creature was working on the window. Just as I got there, the shutter was torn free and thrown aside. A second face appeared in the opening. This one was slightly smaller, its fur a lighter gray, its face less scarred. But the same malevolent intelligence burned in its eyes. It saw me, and its lips peeled back in a snarl, revealing long, yellow fangs. It started to pull itself through the window. I didn't hesitate. I brought the rifle up and fired from the hip. The shot was deafening in the small room. The bullet caught the second creature in the shoulder. It shrieked and fell back out of sight. I didn't wait to see if it was down for good. I knew the big one was still at the front. I had created a momentary opening. It was now or never. I ran back to the main room, grabbed my truck keys from the table, and vaulted over the splintered remains of a chair. The large one was halfway through the front window now, its massive upper body inside the cabin. It was thrashing, trying to get its legs through the narrow opening. It saw me running for the door and let out a roar, reaching for me with a long, clawed arm. I ducked under its swipe, fumbled with the deadbolt, and threw the door open. I burst out onto the collapsing porch, leaped over the broken railing, and landed hard on the ground, rolling to my feet. I didn't look back. I just ran. I sprinted across the clearing towards my truck, my lungs burning, the keys clutched in my hand. I could hear the monster inside the cabin, roaring in frustration, the sounds of it destroying everything in its path as it tried to untangle itself from the window frame. I reached the truck, jammed the key into the lock, and tore the door open. I threw myself inside,
slamming and locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely get the key into the ignition. Behind me, I heard a tremendous crash as the big one finally broke free and burst out of the cabin. The engine turned over. It caught. I slammed the truck into reverse, stomped on the gas, and spun the wheel. The truck fishtailed in the soft dirt, tires screaming, and shot backwards. The big creature was charging, covering the 50 yards between the cabin and me with terrifying speed. Its mouth was open, saliva flying from its jowls. Its yellow eyes were locked on me. I spun the wheel again, throwing the truck into drive. The creature was almost on me. It leaped, its claws outstretched, aiming for the driver's side window. I floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward just as the creature hit. Its claws scraped down the side of the truck with a sound like a giant fork on a plate, missing the window by inches, but leaving deep, parallel scars in the steel. I saw its furious face in my side mirror as I pulled away. It stood in the middle of the clearing, bleeding from the chest, and roared, a sound of pure, thwarted rage that followed me down the mountain. I didn't slow down. I drove like a madman, bouncing over ruts, careening around corners, not daring to look back, expecting to see it bounding out of the trees behind me at any moment. I didn't stop until I was miles down the paved highway, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. I was bleeding from a dozen cuts from the exploding window. My arm was laid open from a piece of flying glass, but I was alive. I never went back. I sold the land, cabin and all, to a timber company for a pittance. I didn't tell them why. I just said I was getting too old for the upkeep. We sold our house in Sandpoint a few months later and moved to the city, to a place where the only wolves are in the zoo and the deepest shadows are cast by skyscrapers, not ancient pines. My wife thinks it's because I wanted a quieter life in my old age. She doesn't know the truth. No one does. I never told another soul the full story of what happened on that mountain. Who would believe me? I'd just be another crazy old man with a wild story. But I know what I saw. I have the scars on my arm and the deeper ones on my soul to prove it. I wake up some nights, the sound of that creature's roar echoing in my ears. I see those yellow eyes, full of a terrifying, thinking hatred. I am a rational man, a man who has always believed in evidence and the natural order of things. But there is nothing in the natural order that can explain what lives in the high, lonely places of this world. We live in a lighted room, convinced it's the whole world. But just outside the door, in the darkness, older things are waiting. Things that hate the light. Things that hate us. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and the birds go silent, and you feel the weight of unseen eyes upon you, don't try to be brave. Don't try to rationalize it. Just leave. Get in your car and drive away, and don't ever, ever go back. Some secrets are not meant to be discovered, and some territories are not meant to be crossed. I crossed them, and I barely made it back alive to tell the tale.